I want to welcome everyone who's joined us today. My name's Anna Marie Benna, and I'm the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And I'm excited to host this panel on climate-related displacement based on a recent joint report, which was titled Climate of Coercion, Environmental and Other Drivers of Cross-Border Displacement. This report and today's webinar are a collaboration between the Human Security Initiative, the International Refugee Assistance Project, and the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And I have with me three of the report's co-authors to discuss their research and policy recommendations for the United States to respond to climate-related displacement in a rights-focused perspective. And as we celebrated Earth Day this month, we were really thinking about the effects that the climate crisis is continuing to have across the world, particularly the most vulnerable countries and groups and populations. So storms like hurricanes and cyclones are becoming longer and more intense as ocean temperatures warm, and droughts are becoming deeper and more prolonged, particularly in fragile contexts like Somalia and Afghanistan. And floods and extreme heat and drought, either too much water or too little of it, threatens the agricultural livelihoods of people around the world. These environmental disasters related to climate, hurricanes, droughts, floods, can force people to leave their homes. And this is particularly the case in our own hemisphere, especially climate vulnerable countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But climate pressures do not occur in a vacuum, nor are they the sole reason a person or a family may move. And these events can intersect with violence and other forms of persecution that form the basis of the protections afforded under international refugee law. And it's that interplay that organizations like ours are trying to understand and to advocate for humane and just policies that allow people to stay in place, and if they must, to relocate in safety and dignity. I want to start off with the lead author of the report, Julia Neusner. She is the director of the Human Security Initiative and has frequently conducted research on the United States-Mexico border. So Julia, could you introduce yourself and discuss how you became interested in putting together this team to advocate and study this issue?
Sure. Thanks so much, Anna Marie, and thank you to the attendees for joining us today. My name is Julia. I use she, her pronouns. And as Anna Marie said, I've been working on refugee protection and border policy issues for many years now. I previously as a research and policy attorney with Human Rights First, and that work brought me to the US-Mexico border quite frequently to interview asylum seekers and migrants about the impact of US policies on their experience attempting to seek protection at the border. And through that work, I just came to understand that climate change, climate-related disasters just kept coming up as a theme in the background of folks, both their decisions, impacting both their decisions to leave their homes and their experiences as they were migrating, whether they had been experiencing heat-related illness in the desert because of being forced across due to the unavailability of asylum at ports of entry, or it was just coming up in a lot of ways, and I hadn't actually done research focused specifically on climate. We've in the advocacy community, we've long known that there's this interplay exists, and we reference it quite often. But I knew there was a need for just more case examples and more targeted research on the interplay between climate change and people's decisions to flee their homes. So in this past January, I had the opportunity to work with a group of Stanford law students in Tijuana. I connected them with USCRI's Tijuana office, with whom I'd worked in the past, so they could help with some legal services. And then I had been collaborating with Daniel and Amma through the RC USA Climate Displacement Working Group, which Daniel now runs. We talked about how we could use this student research team to look into some of these questions that we had about folks' experiences at the border. So So Daniel was able to join us. Amma helped develop these questions, and this report came out of that collaboration.
Great, thank you. So this is a two-part question. The first part is, how did you conduct this research? And the second part is, what did you learn from the interviews about the impact of climate change and climate-related disasters on asylum seekers' decisions to flee their homes?
Sure. So we visited 2 shelters over the course of a week, made multiple visits to Tijuana shelters, housing families and individuals, all of whom intend to seek U.S. asylum and were kind of stranded in Tijuana because of the Title 42 public health order that continues to block access to asylum at ports of entry. So all the folks we spoke to were waiting for opportunities to obtain exemptions to those policies. And I'll add that they illegally block access to asylum so that they could exercise their right to seek protection in the United States. We had a group of 7 law student researchers, and Daniel and myself at the shelters. We interviewed more than 40 people, primarily people from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and all of the student researchers are fluent in Spanish. We conducted the interviews in Spanish. So going into the project, we weren't really expected. We thought that maybe a handful of the people we would talk to would have an answer to our question about how climate change or climate-related disasters impacted their decisions to flee. Just because we know that most of the folks at the border are fleeing targeted violence, domestic abuse, government oppression, because climate change in and of itself does not qualify one for asylum or refugee protection under US law. These people who are seeking asylum have intersecting reasons that, and we weren't sure the extent to which climate would have an impact on those decisions. So we were actually quite surprised to find that almost everyone we spoke to, we would ask, a number of questions about their experience and why they left. Most of them would give one of those reasons I named before, but then as we dug a little deeper, with questions about what their experiences had been like at home when hurricanes hit, if they experienced droughts. Just about everybody said, "Oh, it was terrible." That these disasters had a really, really dramatic effect on their family. One, that they had experienced disasters or climate or other dramatic climate-related impacts, and 2, that they had a really drastic impact on the folks we spoke to, and in many cases interacted with and exacerbated the persecution that drove them to seek protection. I'll just add quickly that there were kind of 3 main ways that that climate change and climate-related disasters impacted folks. First, they have interfered with people's ability to make a living. That was something that we heard quite consistently, whether it was from farmers who said hurricanes just completely destroyed their farms and they struggled to rebuild, or they couldn't rebuild what they'd had before, that the hurricanes destroyed their homes or businesses, and then others who said that they just weren't able to work because natural disasters just shut down the economic activity in the places where they live. So a woman who runs a travel agency, a woman who runs a retail store, were not able to work because of hurricanes, and flooding just made it so people, couldn't leave their houses for so long, and they lost income that way. And then we also heard from many people who work outside that just rising temperatures have made it really difficult and dangerous to continue to do their jobs. So many folks told us that after these hurricanes or other events that caused them to lose work, it drove them into extreme poverty. Everyone we spoke to said the government provided insufficient or no assistance in the aftermath of these disasters. And then for many people who fled organized criminal groups, the natural disasters and other climate effects actually increased their influence. We heard this from a number of people that especially in farming communities who were where community members are no longer able to make a living. Many these organized criminal groups who already control many regions in Central America and Mexico were kind of able to move in and recruit people because they have no other means to survive when their crops are dying and they live in a place that historically has relied on a single type of crop. So they're recruiting more people. They're also taking advantage of vulnerability in these communities we heard a couple of examples of organized criminal groups controlling access to necessary supplies like seeds and fertilizer, taxing supplies that come in from outside, and exercising control over the communities that way. And finally, these organized criminal groups just continue to demand extortion payments. This is something they've been doing for a very long time, but even when these disasters destroy people's businesses, destroy their farms, and they're unable to make a living, we heard from so many people, they don't care, it doesn't matter to them, they just keep collecting their fees just the same, and will respond with violence or threats of violence to people who are unable to pay, in many cases because of the effects of these climate disasters. So many people were fleeing those threats that came out of their inability to pay these extortion payments. And then finally, the climate disasters contribute to illegal land dispossession by degrading environments and natural resources and just reducing the availability of arable land and resources. So that's, something we're seeing all over the world with fewer resources and less land available. Government entities and private industry and organized criminal groups are increasingly moving into the lands of vulnerable people, including indigenous people, to take their land often by force for development or for other purposes. So many asylum seekers flee persecution for their efforts to protect land. And we did speak to a couple of individuals from Mexico whose land was taken by organized criminal groups. One family was attempting to protect their community from deforestation by one of these groups. And the woman we spoke to said that her husband and some of her children were killed for their efforts to defend the forests. And she and the remaining family members were forced to flee because of threats they received. So a lot of interplay and many more examples in the report of climate change and climate impacts exacerbating people's persecution and driving them to flee.
Thanks, Julia. I think that you actually answered the next question that I had for you, but because I really hear and am understanding the themes that you're talking about, but I'll ask anyway to see if there are any additional common themes in the stories that you heard.
Yes, in terms of in terms of the interplay between climate change and climate related disasters and other forms of persecution, that's really the main three kind of categories we heard. Interfering with people's ability to make a living, driving them into extreme poverty, which is very much related to the increasing influence of organized criminal groups who continue to demand extortion payments and take advantage of the vulnerability of these communities to exercise more control over them. And then finally, the illegal land dispossession, again, related to the other two, where much of this dispossession is carried out by government and private industry, but also by organized criminal groups.
So were there any key storms, any specific storms that came up during the interviews?
So most of the people we spoke with were from Central America and Mexico. So and they've all just about all of them had arrived at the border within the past year. So we were able to, we kind of knew, where they had been and what disasters had affected them. We know there's been a lot of drought in southern Mexico. So the farmers who were there, we asked them about, whether they were impacted by those droughts, and many of them were. And then hurricanes Eta and Iota, which hit parts of South and Central America in the past 2 to 3 years. Many folks we spoke to were hit by those hurricanes specifically, but many also just reported increasing flooding and rains within the past year or two. And just that they were seeing stronger storms and higher temperatures with increasing frequency over the years. Pretty much anyone we asked about that said that was the case in the places they came from.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm now going to turn to Daniel Salazar. He's a policy analyst at USCRI. Daniel, could you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about USCRI and what you work on?
Sure. Thank you, Anna Marie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Daniel Salazar at US Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. I'm a policy analyst that focuses primarily on Afghan resettlement, climate-related displacement, and US refugee admissions. And USCRI specifically is one of the national refugee resettlement agencies that works to provide initial resettlement and integration services to refugee newcomers through the US Refugee Admissions Program.
All right, so I'm going to jump right in about the interior part of the report, which discusses pushback policies. What are examples of those pushback policies and how do they affect those who are displaced by gang violence, extortion, and climate change in Central America and Mexico?
Sure. So pushback policies is kind of this like term that gathers up and covers many different actions and measures that states and national governments take to restrict, to contain, or even reverse the movements of migrants, including asylum seekers, as they seek protection under international human rights law. These aren't new phenomenons, but they're certainly a strong factor when we talk about the migration trends that we're seeing, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. In terms of examples, in Mexico, for example, there's quite a few in terms of visa requirements targeted towards specific nationals of specific countries. There's unlawful detention and forcible returns of migrants, restrictions on bus movements within Mexico, particularly from the southern border with Guatemala. All these actions kind of interplay and are taken on behalf of the Mexican state and amount to pushback policies. But there are quite a few in the US context. Julia mentioned it, but Title 42 is probably the most notable one to mention. Title 42 being a section of public health law, of public health code, but over the past 3 years, since March 2020, being invoked to quickly expel migrants and asylum seekers back into Mexico, into third countries, to their countries of origin, rather than processing their asylum claims affirmatively under domestic and international law. Title 42 has gained a lot of attention and obvious criticism for the way that it affects access to asylum. And it also has, questions over its effectiveness when it's been invoked more than 3 million times, and many people end up repeatedly attempting to present themselves at the border. So it doesn't even really achieve its central policy goals of deterring migration or deterring entry without inspection. That said, there currently is an exemption process right now for Title 42, accessible through the CBP-1 mobile application. That's been the main way you can get an appointment at a port of entry along the southern border. However, it's been plagued with tons of technical issues and equitable issues in terms of language barriers, facial recognition biases, and other factors that really make it not really a credible way to gain entry and seek protection within the United States. And then the last one I'll mention is just the proposed asylum rule that's being considered currently by the administration under the notice for proposed rulemaking. It would make this presumption of asylum ineligibility for many individuals And that would also be a pushback policy if it is enacted as currently structured. And it continues this trend that we're seeing in the US and around the world with other countries such as the United Kingdom of externalizing the asylum system, of not allowing people to seek territorial asylum and instead push adjudication and processing of asylum to other countries. And what all these mean together is that people displaced from persecution, whether they have climate as part of their story or not, are not afforded the protections they should be under international law.
Thanks. So the report does also discuss the way that these policies you've just talked about, restricting asylum, make people more vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change along their journey. Can you talk about the impact of these policies on those people who are seeking protection?
Sure. And I mentioned, not receiving protection under international law, is one way to say it, but I mean, in reality, it does mean that in practical terms, people are pushed into harsher, more dangerous terrain from pushback policies and other factors. Pushback policies have certainly contributed to the widespread irregular migration through the Darien Gap, the rugged, very dangerous stretch of jungle between Colombia and Panama, where many migrants attempt to cross as a land crossing between South America and Central America. Migrants frequently disappearing, getting injured, getting sick, even dying through this route. And it's clearly a result of pushback policies and also the breakdown of other safe and legal pathways, both within our hemisphere and then for other populations, such as Afghans. And USCRI has done some work on that in particular. Additionally, people are feeling compelled to make the journeys, as Julia mentioned, through terrain that's being made more dangerous because of climate change. The number of migrant deaths going up, this most recent fiscal year being one of the worst rates since 1998, I believe, and stretches of the southwest border, such as the Sonoran Desert, being very dangerous on foot, particularly through these irregular migration routes, not just in the summer, but also in the winter. And again, in practical terms, what this means is people are left stranded in Mexico, waiting at the border. From there, they're subject to more violence, to more extortion, and more crowded and unsafe conditions. And we all saw the tragedy of the facility fire in Ciudad Juarez last month, and those are the types of dangers that these pushback policies are creating people being in extended periods of limbo for a chance that's not really going to show up for them or come.
So I'm really interested in your response to this next question. Displacement may be temporary. It may be an intermediate step a family takes. And as we've seen, displacement can be more protracted, lasting years or decades. Could you discuss the interplay between temporary and permanent humanitarian protections and how they relate to this context of climate-related displacement?
Sure. And that's part of the issue is, some displacement from climate change is going to be short term. If floodwaters recede, storm waters recede, or storms end, if people have the capacity and the support to do so, they will return to their residences and their places of business. But other phenomena that are covered by climate change or caused by climate change are going to be much more long-term or even permanent, whether it's sea level rise, saline intrusion into coastal water supplies, desertification into the interior. And the issue becomes too, it's hard to know when people are displaced by these phenomena or multiple interactions between them, that they don't know the duration or extent of their displacement. It's just an immediate response to the harm. And so the question then becomes of how do we tailor protections to the severity and duration of displacement? And there are some policies in the US that kind of address this. That's kind of the idea behind something like temporary protected status. A country experiences a disaster, a conflict, other extraordinary conditions, and countries can be designated, and nationals from that specific country are receive protections from removal and right to work authorization. The issue comes with TPS, or multiple issues really, is that you have to be in the United States at the time of the designation to benefit from it. And then also the fact that countries on TPS are frequently, remain designated for years. And so people are being beneficiaries of a temporary status when the underlying conditions in the country are going to remain fragile or unsafe for many years. And so as Julia, Ama, and I, as well as David, Charlotte, and Nasran thought about the recommendations, we wanted to try and take a holistic approach, recognizing that there is kind of a role for temporary protections like TPS, but then also coming to terms with the fact that the US is going to need a serious policy discussion about how do we extend more permanent protections in the face of what are expected to be permanent changes, to our climate. Should there be a climate specific pathway? Are there ways that the US refugee admissions program can be tailored in a way to reach refugee populations that are affected by climate change? And so these are the sorts of conversations that our report is trying to join. They're certainly ongoing. And we basically wanted to make sure that what we do contribute is thinking about these protections and the displacement they're responding to in a holistic manner and not in an ad hoc half measure sort of way.
All right, thank you, Daniel. And now I will go to Ama Francis, who is climate strategist at International Refugee Assistance Project. Thank you for joining us. Could you introduce yourself and the work you do for IRAP?
Sure. Thanks so much, Anna Marie, and thanks to Daniel and Julia for kicking us off to such a great start. I'm Ama Francis. I use they, them pronouns, and I lead the climate work at the International Refugee Assistance Project, IRAP. IRAP is a legal organization that litigates, so we sue people, we provide direct representation, and we also do federal and state and local advocacy, all in support of displaced people. We started our climate work about 2 years ago because we were seeing unofficially that climate change was affecting our clients. And we wanted to start to think strategically and organizationally about how to close the legal protection gap that Julia and Daniel have already started talking about.
So the next question that I'm going to ask you, as you said, Daniel kind of started the discussion on it, but I'll ask you to continue. So the report includes policy recommendations for the US government to improve protection for climate displaced people. What US policies are currently in place to protect climate displaced people, and are they effective?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think Daniel got us off to a really good start. And I wanted to just highlight two things from Julia and Daniel's remarks before digging into the details. One is the importance of approaching US policy on climate displacement from a regional lens. As we've heard from others, US policy has an outsized influence on other countries within the Western Hemisphere, within the Americas in very concrete ways. And people are also moving across multiple countries as they make their way to the US. So part of the work that I do is to really think about US policy, but in a regional context, especially from an advocate's perspective. So that means partnering with organizations in other countries, but also bringing that to bear on the analysis. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight from Julia's remarks is just the fact that climate displacement is an issue that is happening right now. I think sometimes on these Zoom webinars, we're sitting all across the world, but we can think of climate displacement as a future date issue. But I think one thing the report does really poignantly is point out and underline the fact that this is currently a reality for many folks. And that's why existing legal policy, legal frameworks are so important to use. So in the US, we have two frameworks generally that within existing law that are relevant. One is temporary protected status, which Daniel already mentioned, TPS, and the other is the asylum and refugee resettlement framework linked to the refugee definition. Both of these frameworks are existing tools in our toolbox for meeting the needs of people right now, but they are definitely inadequate. They each have pros and cons. So Quickly, temporary protected status, Daniel already mentioned this. It only applies to people who are in the US at the time of a disaster. So while it's unique and important in being one of the few US immigration laws that actually mentions environmental disasters, both sudden onset and slow onset, if you're a person who's experienced an environmental disaster outside of the US, it's not really going to help you, which is a huge shortfall. Which the asylum and refugee resettlement framework sort of addresses. So there are people who are currently eligible under current law for refugee protection, and that's because they have intersecting claims, as Julia was alluding to. So people who might be experiencing gender discrimination alongside climate disasters, for example. And it's really important that we train our US officials to recognize this intersection, because what's often happening now is that our officials are hearing, oh, I had this hurricane happened, and then that's the end of this story, or that's the end of the questioning. And so we're leaving people behind who actually are eligible for refugee protection under our current law. So just in terms of the existing frameworks, I think there are a couple of important things to do. One is making sure that we actually use TPS. Many advocates have been calling for designation of Guatemala and redesignation of El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua for TPS protection, and that hasn't happened yet. So we need to do that. And then within our refugee protection framework, we need to be better training our officers to be recognizing the intersection between climate change and these established protection grounds as well.
All right, thank you. So the next obvious question is, what policy changes would you recommend? And are there examples that we can look to in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying that in this administration in particular, there's been a lot of momentum around climate action, and that's been great to see. And there has been there's been momentum in the opposite direction on immigration. And so part of the work, I think, for us is to make sure that we're bringing this momentum around climate justice to bear on momentum around immigrant and migrant justice as well, that we're wedding these two forces together, especially within the US. And that's important because we need momentum to actually support the creation of new law. As the White House reported a couple of years ago now on climate change's impact on migration, and one thing that the White House said very clearly is that we have some law in the US, but it's inadequate. We need Congress to act to fill gaps. And that's for a couple of reasons. Our laws aren't really responsive to situations where people can't return at all because of long-standing environmental and climate impacts. And also our laws, as I mentioned before, aren't necessarily allowing people to move out of harm's way before disaster strikes. We sort of wait for a crisis to happen and then act. And so in order to have laws that are proactive, that protect people's dignity, that allow people to experience agency while making a migration journey, it's really important that we establish new laws. For IRAP, that looks like a humanitarian visa that's offered to people who are displaced in a changing climate. But there are other proposals as well around complementary protection. Senator Markey is planning to introduce a new bill that creates a system similar to resettlement for climate displaced people. So there are a few options, but I think everyone agrees that we need some new tools in the box as well.
Okay. The final recommendation in the report discusses how climate considerations can be streamlined into asylum intake procedures. You talked a little bit about how in an asylum interview, it just stops after you say hurricane or another event. I understand that IRAP is particularly active in this area. What can you tell us about the work that you're doing in this space and why it's important?
Yeah, we're doing the work to do the legal analysis. So I'll take a step back because there are, I don't know the 100 of you who have joined, thank you for joining us. I don't know where you're coming from, how much you know about asylum or refugee resettlement, but in the refugee definition, there are various categories that are grounds for protection, like gender or race, and there's no ground for climate, so to speak. So because of this, people often have a knee-jerk reaction when they hear climate change and asylum. They think, well, this is not in the framework, this is not at all relevant. And so part of the work that we've been doing at IRAP is to really tease out the legal analysis that shows how people might have, how people who are climate displaced might have valid claims for protection under current law. That looks like scoping out various case examples and fact patterns, and then also doing the legal analysis around connecting the stories and the links, the dots between climate disasters and gender or racial discrimination. Yeah, and the hope is that with some advocacy, we can actually get USCIS officials to be trained on climate change. That's the end goal here.
Great. I feel like a lot of what you just said could create a whole other 45-minute conversation, but I want to keep an eye on our time. And we do have almost 10 minutes, not quite 10 minutes left. So I wanted to invite participants to put questions into the question and answer. And there actually are already a couple of questions here. And so I will go ahead and start pulling some of the questions that have come up and see who might be able to take these. So the first question is, and it's very relevant to what you were just talking about, Amma, so this may be one for you. It says, what resources are needed to process the influx of refugees who would request asylum should your recommendations be adopted?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know Daniel and Julia will definitely have thoughts on this as well. But one thing we're seeing today is I think a divestment, you could say, from the asylum system. I think there's generally a push to, as Daniel was talking about, deter people from actually seeking asylum. So I think the question is important, not just talking about climate displaced people, but how can we be ensuring humanitarian protection for all people who are seeking safety in a changing climate? So I will start the answer by saying it's important to be thinking not just about resources to support the processing of climate affected asylum seekers, but all asylum seekers that are seeking safety in the US.
Okay, so our other question that we have right now, he admittedly notes that his question isn't too related to today's topic, but I'm going to go ahead and still put it out there for each of you. The person is asking about whether you've noticed a surge of Afghan asylum seekers since the US withdrew from Afghanistan. And what I was thinking was that it was connecting that we are seeing Afghans coming across the southern border. And I didn't know if anybody on the panel wanted to address that. Daniel?
Yes, I'll go ahead and respond to that. I'll also add to Amma's response on kind of the importance of building and supporting the underlying infrastructure for the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the appropriations and accounts and that actually support the main program. For those in the resettlement space, you know, like the supplemental funding that's happened over the last couple of years for the Afghanistan and Ukrainian crises have certainly been important, but I think it's worth knowing that in terms of how do we carry out making sure that folks have access to legal services and other support, that the actual standing infrastructure, aside from any crisis, has the capacity to respond to whatever levels of displacement and migration happen, and how that interplays with ORR eligible populations. In terms of the other question, yes, there have been, as I mentioned, there have been various news reports about some of the people crossing the Darien Gap have been Afghans, Afghan nationals who basically have acquired a humanitarian visa to Brazil, typically, and then have traveled up to present themselves at the southern border between the United States and Mexico. And as I alluded to, it's, you see these sorts of dangerous, irregular migration sort of patterns when there are a breakdown of safe legal pathways that actually extend protection in a timely and effective manner. We don't have enough time. I could talk about how asylum adjudications for Afghans are going, how special immigrant visas for Afghans are going, but humanitarian parole applications for Afghans, because legal pathways have broken down and not effectively served that population, you do see those side effects of Afghans crossing the Darien Gap along with other populations. So it's tied, but I think it's still relevant to the conversation.
Okay, and at the beginning, Julia was mentioning how you had law students who were working with you on this project, and we do have a question that's asking, how can aspiring advocates and current law students get involved in this work? Any advice for them?
Sure. And I also just want to go back to the first questions about resources. I just think an important point to make is that there need to be more resources going towards processing of people seeking humanitarian protection. And there also just needs to be a shift from punitive enforcement approach to a more humanitarian approach. So that means rather than pouring money into building new detention centers and increasing the number of officers on the ground, coordinating with local assistance organizations who have long been providing shelter and other services to folks crossing the border, and making sure people arrive safely at sponsors, and like Daniel said, making sure people have access to legal assistance. And that just requires increasing processing capacity at the ports of entry. And at least, with this particular issue on how much the report focuses of folks who are seeking asylum at the border who have also been impacted by climate. And to your question about aspiring legal professionals and students wanting to get involved, I guess a piece of advice I have is to the extent you have research papers and other research projects to do for school, consider focusing them on this issue. Those schools often have budgets to support on the ground research or other types of research. So I think what our report is pretty narrowly focused on people from a certain geographical region and a certain situation. So I think more research is needed on this particular question of the interplay between climate and other drivers of displacement. But we also just need to know more about how these disasters are affecting people in the short and the long term, and what that means for people who choose to leave their homes. So use your university institutional resources to try to get involved with some of that research. So my consulting group includes a lot of those Stanford law students who worked on this report, and we meet periodically to discuss new research opportunities. We're going to and we have a number of initiatives. So if anybody wants to get involved in our conversations, we would love to have you. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And then finally, just look for local organizations if you are that serve refugees and immigrants. They exist all over the country. If you want to specifically work on border issues, I always need to plug Al Otro Lado, which is the organization that got me into this work while I was a law student. They're based in Tijuana. They do really incredible work, and they do a lot to engage outside folks who want to help. So again, reach out to me, if you want some more specific tips on organizations to link up with.
All right, thank you, Julia. And Julia, did you offer your, I think it's, so for folks who are on and may not be able to see it, it's Julia, Julia, at HUMSI.org.
Thanks, Anna Marie. Yeah, I think the chat is not visible to the attendees, but yeah, just my first name, Julia, HUMSI, Human Security Initiative. That's how we're abbreviating it.org. Thanks.
All right, so we have come to the end of our time, and I feel like talking about how to get others involved is a really great way to end the conversation. And I want to thank all of the panelists for being here to talk about the report. And I want to thank all the participants for joining. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.